Beyond Appomattox, the surrenders of the Confederacy. I thought today would be a particularly appropriate time to talk about that because, of course, the Juneteenth holiday, June 19th, which we'll celebrate tomorrow, actually is my birthday. So now it is rightfully a federal holiday, which I really appreciate. Thank you all. Um, but it became a holiday as a result of the ripples that come about because of these different surrenders. And we'll touch on that in just a few moments. I want to give a shout out to my friend Bert Dunkerley. A lot of the information that I'll cover tonight is stuff that he came up with in his emerging Civil War book, To the Bitter End. It was an early book in our series. I worked with him on it. I thought it was just a fascinating story of how the surrender, how the Confederacy sort of unraveled. So if you want more information on the things that I talk about tonight, I encourage you to pick up Bert's book. I want to give us a couple pieces of context before we kind of get into the actual surrenders. And the first comes on April 4th, 1865, as Abraham Lincoln and his son tore through the surrendered capital of Richmond, the Confederate capital of Richmond. And as they're walking through and they're just kind of seeing the results of the war on the city, and they're being mobbed by newly emancipated enslaved people. The Navy person that's with him is David Farragut, or excuse me, David Porter, excuse me. And Porter says to him, like, what should we do if like we capture some of these Confederate personnel? What should we, do with them? Where should they go? And Lincoln says, well, it's really a matter for the military, but if it was up to me, I'd let them up easy. And that really reflects that beautiful sentiment that he articulates in his second inaugural address, which to me is my favorite of his pieces of writing: with malice toward none, with charity for all. And so he has this very magnanimous, very charitable vision for what the post-war period would look like. We never get to find that out because of his assassination. We don't know exactly what he mapped out as he met frequently with Ulysses S. Grant and with Sherman and with Porter in those last couple of weeks of the war. They spent a great deal of time discussing kind of Lincoln's vision for peace, and that's going to stamp pretty significantly on Grant's psyche as he sort of navigates these waters that we're going to talk about tonight. So I think that spirit of generosity is one really important bit of context for us. The second comes from April 7th, 1865. Robert E. Lee's army is fleeing westward, trying to turn the flank around the Federal army that's hot in pursuit. And if he can get to the south of them, get around their pursuing columns, he can maybe get down into North Carolina and link up with Joe Johnston and try to resume offensive operations. But as things get increasingly bleak for his retreating forces, they think they're going to get food and they don't. They lose the Battle of Sailor's Creek. A quarter of his forces get captured. And some of his subordinates get together and they think like, gosh, what options are available to us? Well, we could fight it out, we could surrender, or we could scatter to the hills and converge someplace at a pre-designated time and then try to carry things on. And nobody really wants to present that third option to Lee because they know that that's just not the kind of thing that Lee is going to go for. Lee, as a military man of honor, said, we're going to decide this on the battlefield, and it looks like that decision may be going against us. But those were the rules of engagements that we agreed to, and that's what we're going to stick with. But Edward Porter Alexander, the artillerist, does present this idea to him in the morning of April 9th. And Lee sort of laughs it off, but he's serious about it too. And he says, that might be okay for you younger guys. I'm too old for that sort of thing. But he really poo-poos that idea of scattering and conducting guerrilla warfare because he knows that the first people that will suffer will be the civilians. As his army scatters into the wilderness, how are they going to support themselves? They're going to have to raid farms. They're going to have to raid houses and, wage war on their own civilian population. And Lee certainly doesn't want that. And then the logistics of how do you support that army if you do get back together? And guerrilla warfare is the kind of thing that can just go on and on and on and on with no real resolution, and increasing animosity, and just gets uglier and uglier. And we've had wars in Afghanistan, for instance, that have demonstrated that, Vietnam that have demonstrated that. And so, one of those lessons of history that I think we have since learned is that very lesson that Lee very presciently thought about back in April of 1865. And so I present that as a bit of context for us too, because what if he had decided something else? What if he thought like, yeah, we are going to drag this out? And so he makes a really important stamp on these surrenders as they unfold through the example that he sets. My friend Rob Orison really calls that the greatest gift Robert E. Lee gives the United States. And I would agree with that statement because he certainly had the wherewithal, the moral standing to make a different decision that people would follow. And instead, he says, this is how this is going to play out. So I want us to keep those two things in mind as we kind of look at how this all happens. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on Appomattox. Most of you guys know about it. It's the one surrender we know about, Ulysses S. Grant versus Robert E. Lee in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox Courthouse. Lee tries to break out one final time in the morning of the 9th, and he can't. And so that's when he sends word to Grant that he'd like to get together and negotiate a surrender. And he says, I would rather die 1,000 deaths. But he puts on his best uniform because he knows that pretty soon he's going to be General Grant's prisoner. And he goes forward to have this conversation with Grant. Grant, who'd been lagging behind the army trying to keep up, spattered with mud, dust, he rushes to the battlefield. And so, where Lee shows up in just regal splendor in his finest military uniform. Grant trying to show courtesy, like get there as fast as possible. Let's take care of this. Doesn't go for that sense of show, and he's worried that he's going to offend Lee as a result of that. But the two of them have a very cordial chit chat, and eventually Lee kind of prods him to get on to business, and they come up with terms. I just want to remind you of what those initial terms are, because again, they're going to stamp how these events unfold. We do know that Lincoln had laid out a couple important preconceptions. He had said that the restoration of national authority throughout the United States was going to be one of three indispensable things. No receding by the executive of the United States on the slavery question. In other words, we're not going to rescind the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation's a thing now. And then he also says no cessation of hostility short of an end of the war and the disbanding of all forces hostile to the government. So, we're not going to take a pause. We're not going to, everybody be in a holding pattern while we talk things out. We're going to have like a complete surrender. Aside from that, Lincoln really kind of left it up to Grant. And so what he wants to do is kind of lay things out that the arms, artillery, and public property will be parked and stacked and turned over to the officers appointed by Grant to receive them. He's going to give officers and soldiers paroles not to take up arms until they're properly exchanged. But we all know there's not going to be an exchange. They're going to go off into military limbo and stay there. And that sense, in essence, makes them a type of prisoner of war, but they get to be out on their own recognizance. That becomes important in how Grant's going to then deal with pardons and charges of treason and all that after the war during the Johnston administration. And he says once all this is done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by the United States authority, so long as they observe their paroles. And again, this becomes a real important point of honor for Grant as well, because as things get more and more vindictive after Lincoln's assassination, and Johnson really kind of looking to put his stamp on things, he wants to go out for blood. And Grant's like, hey, listen, we had an agreement. And if these soldiers knew that these new rules were going to come into effect, I'm certain they would not have agreed to lay down their arms. So we need to really be careful about this. Eventually, Grant will have to threaten to resign if Johnson doesn't abide by these terms. And that's a real big thing because Grant's the guy who saves the country. What an embarrassment it would be to an unpopular president if the very popular general-in-chief of the army resigns over a military matter in the end of the war. So that becomes these terms become really important. But really, Appomattox gives us that nice, neat, tidy ending. It's the first of a series of surrenders It's the only one where the armies are going to be in contact with each other. It's the only time where the commanders really sort of get face to face and hash things out from scratch. Um, and there's a stacking of arms ceremony and things that don't happen in some of the other surrenders. So in a way, this is really just the beginning of the end. And as we push forward, we'll see just how messy the story becomes as the yarn unravels. And maybe that's one reason why we look at Appomattox and we think of that as the end of the war, the final surrender. And certainly Lee's surrender does carry a lot of emotional and moral and figurative and metaphorical weight, but there's still a lot of Confederates in the field at this point. But I'm convinced that, we love our stories, and this presents our story of the Civil War. It's a tragedy, and here finally we get our hint of a happy ending. We don't want all the messy nonsense that's going to come after this. Here we've got these two men getting together honorably, face to face, looking at each other like in this picture, looking at each other in the eye, and from it springs all these great stories. The story of the apple tree, where supposedly Lee was waiting under an apple tree at an orchard when he got news of the Grant coming. And so soldiers descend on the whole apple orchard and chop it all up and say they've got a splinter of the tree under which Robert E. Lee surrendered. And Grant kind of chuckles about that. He says it's like the stories of everyone who said they've got a piece of the one true cross, and it's like, we might equate that to like for everybody who said they were at Woodstock, who was really there. Okay. But Grant says wars produce many stories of fiction, some of which are told until they are believed to be true. The War of the Rebellion was no exception to this rule, and the story of the apple tree is one of these fictions based on a slight foundation of fact. And Appomattox becomes this wellspring of all of these great stories as part of that great narrative that I talked about a few minutes ago. So it's got tremendous narrative power. Of course, maybe one of the most famous is that of Wilmer McLean, who originally lived just outside of Manassas, Virginia, and Civil War erupted there during the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. So he packs up his family, moves as far away from the war as he can get, settles down in nice, quiet Appomattox, and then suddenly the war shows up at his house on his doorstep in April of 1865. And he used to like to go around telling people that the war started in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. And when soldiers at the surrender found out about this, they go and ask him for his autograph. He charges him $1 a piece. So the enterprising businessman Wilmer McLean looking to make a little bit of money off of his great coincidence. And that's just one example of some of these great stories that spring up around Appomattox. We've got George Custer riding forward with the flag saying, demanding a surrender from James Longstreet, who kind of chuckles him off, knowing that there are other negotiations going on elsewhere on the line. And so Custer, unfortunately, is not able to claim credit for capturing the Confederate army. We've got Eli Parker, the Seneca Indian, who is in the room as Grant's personal secretary. And when Lee looks at him and he says, "I'm glad that we have at least one American here with us." And Parker responds, generally, we are all Americans, in this act of magnanimity and reconciliation. We have that great story of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, who has been designated to receive the official stacking of arms. We have John Brown Gordon, who's leading that first batch of Confederates forward. And Chamberlain sees this foe that his men have fought so bravely and valiantly for so long, and he orders his men to show arms and to present arms and show a salute. And Gordon, immediately recognizing this tribute, orders his men to return the salute. And these two great warriors, who happen to be wonderful, colorful writers who love to add flourish to their language, they write these stories about how this moment takes place. And we love those sorts of stories. And so that's another reason why Appomattox becomes so powerful for us. And it's not necessarily the details of what actually happened, who said what, who's in the room, blah, blah, blah. It's this larger sense that it gives us. And of course, it becomes very popular. People, start drawing it, sketching it, painting it, selling prints. Here we have Lee and Grant, both with abnormally large heads, sitting down together to sign out the terms. And, Grant's open hand of friendship. And here we have the armies all stacked up outside. And here we have this great scene for folks to remember. But, it's not quite accurate because we do have Charles Marshall in the room, and Grant's got a couple guys. So we're still going to put them in the foreground. They're going to be lighter shades. These guys are darker in the background, so they're not stealing the spotlight. But, let's, make sure that we got some people in the room that are supposed to be there. But that's not enough. So let's really kind of make sure that we've got some more folks in here, including George Custer, who's really out trying to get James Longstreet to surrender. And so, gosh, why is he there? And we've got Grant huddled over his desk. And so now we've got some more folks who are in here in the room. But, people wanted to be able to say they were in at the death. They were there. So, hey, we need to redo this and make sure we've got all the right people that are in there. And hey, I was there too. And this guy wasn't there. And so let's make sure that we're getting the picture right. And we got Lee kind of leaning over, signing his uh, um, surrender copies over here. But you know what? I think we're still missing some folks. So let's do this again. And here we've got Parker and Marshall over here in very prominent spots. And here now we have the two commanders looking at each other very nobly. Grant looking very spiffy for being a mud-spattered guy. Everybody else sort of lined up in the background. But wait, is everybody there that's supposed to be? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We've got 12 guys here. I don't think that's quite enough. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oops, can't count Grant. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then we got this sketchy creeper in the background. Who the heck is that? We can see the overweight Phil Sheridan right here and a very sad looking Robert E. Lee as he's signing with his back to Grant. But it's the Park Service wanted to make this as historically possible. So we got actually one extra person in here. We're getting rid of some folks who weren't here. So we're weeding things out. We're trying to create history here. But remember, this isn't really about history. It's about memory. It's about being able to be there. It's about that sense. So we got to have that formal portrait. We're going to put Meade in there. He's the Army of the Potomac commander. He was too sick to be there in real life, but we got to give him some credit. So let's put him in the room. And hey, we need to have Taylor and Marshall there in the background and Lee. This looks an awful lot like Lee sitting on his porch just a few days later as he's photographed. Very casual Eli Parker there. And so here with Wesley Merritt, not even paying attention to everything that's going on in here. So now we're cramming the room, trying to make sure that we've got a portrait we can sell that's really got all these prominent folks in there because people want to be able to say there. But, we got more people like, where's Wilmer McLean? So let's work him in here. Stonewall Jackson's dead, but he'll sell prints. So let's at least get his arm in there, the little monument for his arm. John Breckinridge, if you know anything about his career, he's everywhere in the Confederacy. So we got to put him in there, right? He shows up every place. And John Brown Gordon, we know he shows up there a couple of days later. His memoir, he is not only here in the room as this takes place, he's sweeping off against the Blitzkrieg, defeating Hitler's Panzer divisions, taking Moscow in the winter. I always like to talk about hyperbolic as stuff is. A good citizen's going to have a portrait of Abraham Lincoln in the back. Lincoln's going to be dead in just a couple of days, but let's get his portrait in there. And hey, look, here's a picture of Joe Hooker at Lookout Mountain. He fashioned a picture of himself at Lookout Mountain as the star of the show. Let's get that up in there. We've got the silent witness over here, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. It's not the same without him. And here's him as an old man because he kept coming back to the war over and over and over and over again his whole life. So, you get the idea that it isn't about what's taking place from a factual point of view. It's what Appomattox comes to mean to people. And unfortunately, that does obscure the story of what actually happens and why, because that is important as the story of the surrenders goes forward. I want to kind of go to my favorite story from Appomattox, and it happens to be true. James W. Albright, he's from the 12th Virginia Artillery Battery, but he actually lived around Greensboro, North Carolina. And so he is among the troops that surrenders with Lee, except he doesn't want to surrender. So he's going to slip away and try to link up with Joe Johnston's army down in his state of North Carolina, where he's from. And he wants to keep fighting. And he finally gets down to Greensboro only to discover by that point that Johnston has also surrendered. Albright owns a print shop. And so he will actually be put to work by Sherman's army to open up his print shop, get the presses going, and he will print out paroles for Johnston's army down in North Carolina. So just kind of some interesting little connections that take place. Those surrender discussions begin April 17th, 1865. Joe Johnston has been able to successfully stay out of reach of Sherman's army. Sherman trying to catch up. Johnston staying out of reach. Not a big surprise. Johnston falling back in front of a superior foe, waiting for that right opportunity. But he, and Johnston's been talking with Robert E. Lee about finding a way to link up so that their combined forces still might stand some sort of chance. And so he finally does get word that Lee has surrendered, and now he knows he's kind of like the last army in the East that's still in the field. He doesn't want to find himself in battle with Sherman, because if he can hold the integrity of his army together, he can negotiate from a position of strength. But if he starts bleeding desertions and his army disintegrates, he'll have no bargaining chips. So that's kind of what Johnston's objective here is. And he's going to find himself out near Greensboro. Sherman's still back near Raleigh. And so the two of them then kind of send messages back and forth, like, let's get together and kind of talk about this. And so they're going to try to meet partway between. And so a little place, Bennett Place outside of Durham, they're going to get together and start negotiations. Just before Sherman leaves for those negotiations, he gets word about Lincoln's death. And he understands that this is absolutely a calamity. And he orders the cone of silence over the telegrapher's office and his staff. He doesn't want word of this to get out because he realizes that his soldiers will be angry. And there's a real chance of rioting. There's a chance of revenge, retribution. So he wants to try to keep this on the QT as long as he can until he can get something worked out with Johnston. So when the two of them do get together in the front parlor of the Bennett Place, Sherman shares the news with Johnston, and Johnston goes pale, and he knows this is like the worst disaster that could befall the Confederacy. And that's a pretty widespread sentiment throughout the Confederate government and throughout the Confederate high command. They really saw, by this point, Lincoln as a friend or an ally who would negotiate that kindler, gentler peace. And now things are really going to take a turn. And so as Johnston and Sherman start talking, they can't quite figure out what to do. And also with them is John Breckinridge. He's there in his capacity as Secretary of War. And at first, Sherman won't acknowledge him in that capacity because they won't acknowledge the Confederate government. But Johnston says, well, he's here as a Major General. And Sherman's like, all right, well, as a military figure, fine. So as they're talking, Sherman gets out a flask out of his pocket, and he takes a drink from his flasks, and he passes it to Johnston. He passes it to Breckinridge, and puts it away. And eventually he'll get it out and he'll take another swig and put it away, and he doesn't offer to Johnston Breckinridge. And Breckinridge gets super, super aggravated because he says any fine Kentucky gentleman would know how desperately we needed a drink from that flask. They take their bourbon seriously in Kentucky. So when Sherman and Johnston initially start talking, they can't really sort of figure out what terms they want. So Sherman says, well, you go back, you talk to your guys tonight, and let's meet here tomorrow. And I'll go back, put some things down, I'll confer with Grant, and we'll be back tomorrow. So that's when Johnston comes back and brings Breckinridge with him, and the whiskey thing takes place. They've also had the chance to talk to Jefferson Davis, who has been fleeing from Richmond. First he goes to Danville, then he's heading down toward Charlotte. We'll talk about him in just a minute. But he talks with these guys and he says, fight it out, fight it out. We're not ready to surrender. We're keeping the government going. We're going to keep things going. Don't give up. And Johnston, Breckinridge, the other staff look at each other like, this guy's nuts. Like, there's nothing going on. So Johnston will actually disobey orders and negotiate these terms with Sherman. And when they get together, he starts saying, well, we want this and we want that, and we're going to have this, and we're going to. And finally, Sherman calls a timeout and he says, look, you seem to forget who's doing the surrendering here. And that kind of puts a little damper on things. So Sherman starts writing things out based on the conversation, based on his consultation, based on the terms that Grant has suggested. Sherman and Johnston feel like, though, they have the chance to really negotiate a peace, not just a surrender. And so the terms they come up with are broad and sweeping, well-meaning, but overly broad. And When they eventually make their way to Washington, Secretary of War Stanton absolutely puts the kibosh on him. He's a lawyer. He's looking for every single loophole that shows up in these terms, and he can see all these different ways that the Confederates might exploit these surrender terms. Let me just kind of hit some of these highlights. The two armies in the field will maintain the status quo. Confederate armies now in existence will be disbanded and conducted to their several state capitals. Their arms and public property will be stacked in the state arsenals. Now, think about that. Like, you guys just keep your guns, take them all to the state arsenal. Like, why would you let your enemies keep their weapons in case hostilities break out again, right? The recognition by the executive of the United States of the several state governments. So immediately, the presidency and the federal government will recognize all of the Confederate state governments. The reestablishment of all federal courts, political rights and franchises, as well as their rights of person and property, will be guaranteed. Well, gosh, property. What does that mean in the South? How does that balance against Lincoln's views of emancipation as articulated in the Emancipation Proclamation? Yeah, we're getting into some sketchy stuff there. The United States government will not disturb any of the people by reason of the late war. And in general terms, the war will cease. A general amnesty, so far as the executive of the United States can command, on the condition of the disbandment of the Confederate armies, the distribution of arms, the resumption of peaceful pursuits by the officers and men. And so, again, a very magnanimous, well-intentioned effort at a larger peace, and it doesn't fly. And Stanton actually gives orders to Grant to go down to North Carolina and fire Sherman and offer Johnson the same terms that Grant had given to Lee. Grant didn't want to do that. He didn't want to embarrass one of his top lieutenants. And so he goes down and he tells Sherman, like, look, here's the deal. You go out there, you talk to Sherman, to Johnson, get this squared away. This is a no-go. Tell Johnson we're going to have to resume offensive operations if he doesn't come back to the table, and this is what you're allowed to offer him. And so Sherman is allowed to save face, and he goes out and he'll carry that grudge against Stanton and against Halleck as a result of that, though. But he'll go out and they will finally get together for a third time in the Bennett parlor and negotiate this final peace. We don't get the big stories that came out of Appomattox. Here's a painting that shows Johnson looking very stern, Sherman looking very stern. We don't have them face to face looking like they're really kind of coming to some agreement. And we have a very angry Wade Hampton over here and a very angry Judson Kilpatrick, who had started out cordially enough and get into a big argument out in the yard and say, like, let's just settle this with one big cavalry charge. That'll end the war, and whoever wins that wins the war. They have to be physically separated. Hampton from here will then split away from Johnson's army, head down toward South Carolina, his native state, to see if he can try to kind of rally any support down there, but his cavalry will disperse along the way. So that's kind of what we end up with out of Bennett Place, is a bit more animosity, a very messy set of terms, not a lot of warm and fuzzy memories that come out of it. Jefferson Davis, meanwhile, continues his flight to the south. You can see here Greensboro. This is where he met with Johnson and Breckinridge. He's going to continue down to Charlotte, York, Greenville, all the way down to Irwinville, Georgia by the time he does. And as the army first leaves Richmond, and Robert E. Lee had been telling Davis, like, if the Federals ever break through, I'm not going to be able to hold them. So, like, have a plan. And when the Federals finally do break through on April 2nd, Davis is in church and he's like, can you hold them off 48 hours? And Lee's like, no, I told you I wouldn't be able to. So it's a really sort of pell-mell flight for the Confederate government, who throws papers, leaves literally a paper trail as it's fleeing to the south, very disorganized. As they get to Danville, down to Greensboro, down to Charlotte, they begin sort of bleeding cabinet members, bleeding troops, bleeding escorts. So by the time Davis is all the way down here in Georgia, he's just got a cavalry escort. He's given the Confederate treasury to troopers for safekeeping. So they run off with the Confederate gold. It really is just kind of a sad thing to kind of watch as Davis's entire government just whittles away like dandelion little dandelion wisps in the wind. And all the time, Davis is convinced if he can get to Florida, he can get to Havana, Cuba, he can rally support, and he can continue the war. Probably the best way to describe him through this period is being unhinged. So as he continues forward, you could follow his trail today. There are signs all along the way that talk about different things that happened as his government disintegrates. There's a little marker in the sidewalk in Charlotte that here's where Davis was standing when he heard news of Lincoln's assassination. And so you can follow his flight. The place where he was captured is down in Georgia, is actually a state park. Now, of course, we do have a story that comes from that. He's roused from sleep as Federals are closing in on him. He grabs a shawl that somehow turns into he's wearing women's clothing when he's captured. And so you can see that story. And, I'm not surprised the story springs from this in a way that it doesn't from the surrender at Bennett Place, for instance, because who doesn't love a good story of humiliation, right? And you think about the proud Jefferson Davis reduced to this sort of image and his double quick because he's retreating. And so it is a real humiliating experience for Davis as things wrap up. And, as this is going on, things throughout the eastern part of the Confederacy continue to disintegrate as well. Florida's Governor John Milton, he commits suicide rather than allows himself to get captured. George Stoneman cuts the railroad on one of his raids, and that causes extra panic as folks are trying to flee and the government's trying to kind of keep itself together. When Davis is captured, one of the federal cavalrymen with the 4th Michigan, 1st Wisconsin are the two units that capture him. I can't remember which unit the trooper was with, but he sees some Confederate soldiers who are, kind of part of this disintegration. And he says, "Hey, Johnny Reb, we got your president." And the very quick thinking Confederate says, "Yeah, well, the devil's got yours." So there's a little bit of animosity there. And one soldier really talks about like the giant arms of an octopus as the Federal Army then sends cavalry and different infantry raids throughout the southern part of the Confederacy, just sort of reaching in, capturing all these small outposts, all these pockets of resistance, and really things just continue to kind of fall and disintegrate. Often Federals would give Confederates rations as they did it. And so that does a lot to kind of ease a lot of tensions on the ground. But one Confederate says the air was full of rumors of defeat, victories, terms of peace, unconditional surrender, European interference, etc. Everywhere, the unsettled state of the country provoked deeds of lawlessness. In Greensboro, North Carolina, for instance, after the Confederate Army surrenders, Confederates start looting some of the supplies that are stockpiled there. There's actually going to be some North Carolina troops that are going to be ordered to defend a warehouse. They're going to fire on a crowd of soldiers who come down from Lee's army and folks from Johnston's army and civilians. So some of the last deaths of the Civil War are actually going to be Confederates firing on Confederates. So it really gets to be tense and lawless. Meanwhile, a little further west, the kind of the last force. Oh, and I should also mention Johnston's surrender is going to be the largest surrender of the war. We'll compare numbers in just a little bit, but people forget, they think about Lee's surrender as the surrender. Johnston actually surrenders the largest number of troops. Meanwhile, a little further to the west, we have Richard Taylor, who's been commanding troops out in Alabama. He's facing off against Richard Canby. Taylor is desperately asking for instructions from Richmond, not knowing that Richmond has fallen, that Lee is on the run, communications have been cut off. And so Taylor, trying to figure out what the best course of action is, holding Canby off, but not knowing to what purpose or why. It's important to remember that Mobile doesn't fall until after Lee's surrender. In fact, at the time as Lee is surrendering to Grant, the Federals are assaulting Fort Blakely on the eastern side of Mobile Bay, just up into the Delta. So Mobile is able to hold on, and it's after the fall of Fort Blakely. The Federals then are going to cross Mobile Bay, land south of the city, and then she's like, "Yep, here you go. Here's the key to the city. We're done." Taylor's going to kind of fall northward up into central Alabama, but as we see on this map here, he's got forces spread out all through this area. So he still has plenty of territory. He still has infrastructure. He still has plenty of forces, and he still has a military objective. Remember, one reason Mobile is important, or the main reason Mobile is important at this point in the war, is because of that railroad that goes up to Selma, Alabama, where there's still an arsenal. There's still important Confederate manufacturing. That's the infrastructure that's still going to be able to keep the Confederacy in the war. And so it's still protected at this point. So that's kind of what Taylor's got in mind. Like, should I be giving this up? We see Selma over here, Montgomery over here on this side. Okay. Once Mobile falls, that is going to allow Canby to start moving northward, and he's going to send forces up in this direction toward Montgomery and over towards Selma. And so Taylor's now going to end up with federal forces between him and Richmond, which is further off to the right of my screen here. And so now he's really starting to get nervous. And so without any sort of connection, he's going to turn to the governors of Alabama and Mississippi, and they're going to suggest that he negotiate a surrender. And so he's going to do that. Those two governors will end up getting captured and taken off as POWs over the course of these next few days. But Taylor's going to send word down to Canby, let's get together. And the two are going to meet at a little place down here called the McGee House. It's just north of the city. It had been a Confederate museum for a while. It's now back in private hands. We don't know a whole lot about what went on there. And I'll quote my friend Bert Dunkerley. He said, "If we're plagued by too many conflicting accounts for the Appomattox meeting, the problem here at Citronelle and the McGee House is that there's a lack of any detailed accounts at all. So we don't have a whole lot to draw on. We do know that Taylor is going to take the railroad down from Citronelle. It's going to break down. And so he and his staff and two enslaved people are going to get on one of those old railroad cars where you pump, and they're going to go down the last few miles where Canby and a full contingent of soldiers has marched up. They're in great formation, in parade formation out in front of the McGee House. The two men meet. They have a very cordial conversation. They get down to business. They have things settled pretty quickly. Canby offers essentially the same terms that Grant had offered. Then they chit chat and they get the bands to play some songs, and things look like they're in pretty good shape. And so things look like they're going to resolve themselves pretty well. Taylor goes back up to his headquarters up here in Meridian, and Canby's going to return to Mobile. But that's when word comes from Washington, like, yeah, we're not really content with the negotiations that have gone on, and so you need to resume offensive operations. And so Canby at this point is like, geez, I don't want to do this. And so he sends word back to Taylor, who Taylor says, all right, well, let's get together again. So they're going to meet again. This time, the railroad is broken down north of the McGee House. So Canby's going to have to get on one of those railroad carts and pump his way up on the railroad to Citronelle. And that's where Taylor and a contingent of his troops will be. So it's the exact reversal of what had happened at the McGee House. Here's a picture of the McGee House today. Okay. So when they get together at Citronelle, there's a big tree that's there, and they get together and negotiate these terms. And today, if you go there, there's an abandoned Boy Scout camp. There's rubble in the woods. That's the remains of the Heron House where they had gotten together. And there's a state historical marker there as well as a wayside. So if you're in Mobile and you want to check this off as one of your Civil War sites, it took me about 40 minutes to get up to Citronelle. Pretty drive, although, it's, houses along the way. And then you get there and you're like, this is all there is. There is a museum in Citronelle that has some artifacts from the surrender, but it's only open seasonally by appointment. And anytime I've gone there and tried to get into the museum, I haven't had any luck getting a hold of anybody who could open the museum for me, which is a little unfortunate. But I can say, thanks to the American Battlefield Trust, just last February, I had the chance to be in Mobile and paid my most recent visit to Citronelle. And so it is kind of neat to kind of think about, here's a surrender that was messy, still cordial, has some interesting ironies to it. There are a few physical reminders of what's there, but nothing like a big national park like you have at Appomattox. Nothing that folks remember. There are a lot of people who live in Mobile that don't even know this story took place right on their doorstep. As part of those forces that Taylor surrenders, we have Nathan Bedford Forrest. And let me just kind of point out on this map, Forrest is up here in Gainesville, Alabama. And so lots of Confederates all through this area here. But when Forrest gets word that it's time to surrender on May 9th, he gets his troops together and says, the fact that we're beaten is self-evident, and any further resistance on our part would justly be regarded as the very height of folly and rashness. You are the last of all the troops of the Confederate States Army east of the Mississippi to lay down your arms. You've done a good job. There's a monument there next to this monument that lays out his whole speech. And he basically says, like, we fought the good fight. It's over. Go home and be good citizens. Like, and very similar to kind of Lee's perspective, like we were going to fight this out on the battlefield. We fought as well as we could. We lost. Let's get over it and move on. And he doesn't go so far as to become a Republican. We know that he will go on to eventually found an early iteration of the plan. So not necessarily a gracious loser, but he certainly says, like, look, let's just go home and move on and make the best of this that we can. Any further bloodshed at this point is going to be senseless. I don't want you guys to waste your lives. Let's go. And so there is a monument up there in Gainesville to that. Okay? So then we get to the Trans-Mississippi. Notice we're sort of rippling from east to the Western Theater, which by that point is in North Carolina, then to Alabama. Now we're getting across the Mississippi River. And there are Confederate troops scattered all through Arkansas, through what's known as Indian Territory today, what we call Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana. There's still a going concern in the Trans-Mississippi. And Edmund Kirby Smith really believes that they can still make a stand. Federals have not penetrated effectively into the Trans-Mississippi. He's got a lot of troops, a lot of good defensible positions. He's got a lot of infrastructure. So he really wants to try to make something happen out here. And so it's going to take all through May and into June for this story to kind of play itself out. As it does, the last battle of the war, the Battle of Palmito Ranch, takes place May 12th and 13th down along the Rio Grande in Texas. It's a Confederate victory. So, I mean, kind of giving some teeth to Smith's belief that, like, they can still make something happen out there. They're going to still win. But what's going on as all this is happening? Like back in the East, they're celebrating the end of the war. The Grand Review is going on. The Army of the Potomac marches down Pennsylvania Avenue on May 23rd. The Army of the Tennessee marches down on April 24th. The armies that make up that army group on the 24th. So they're celebrating the end of the war, even as Kirby Smith's like, we can hold on, we can do this, we can keep fighting. So that kind of shows you just how the story is perceived in different ways in different places. But as Smith's trying to figure out, take stock of what he has, his bases in Shreveport, and by this point, troops from Lee's army are starting to kind of filter back home. If they're from Louisiana, Arkansas, some of those troops, some of the Mississippi troops are coming through, and so now word is spreading like the war in the East is over, and so that really is a huge blow to the morale of the troops that are in Kirby Smithdom, and so then they're going to start thinking about, like, well, gosh, what are we doing hanging out here? There are a lot of troops from Louisiana in Smith's army. At one point, he assigned some North Carolinians some Arkansans to guard some of these Louisiana guys. The Louisiana guys get so offended. What? You thought we were going to desert, so you're having us guarded? Well, all right, we'll desert. And they leave. So, I mean, they're just all sorts of crazy stuff. In the meantime, it gets so unsafe that Smith and his staff officers can't go outside at night without fear of violence because lawlessness is kind of descending over the land. So what Smith decides to do is he's going to head down to Galveston, gather what forces he can there, and then make a break for Havana, where he can then link up with Jefferson Davis and carry on the war from there. So he's going to leave Simon Bolivar Buckner in charge here in Shreveport. Meanwhile, and here's Buckner over here. Buckner, of course, has the distinction of surrendering the first Confederate Army during the war. He will be passed the buck, as it will, and have to surrender Confederate forces at Fort Donelson. And now here he's going to find himself in another precarious, surrender-prone situation. Meanwhile, John Magruder is in command of forces down here in Texas, down in Galveston. He's buried there just by coincidence, although it was a long road for him to come back. It wasn't necessarily because he stayed. Um, so, as Smith is making his way down here, the situation all through here deteriorates so badly that as the senior officers get together, they decide to send Buckner down to New Orleans to confer with Canby's army and see about surrendering. The man who's stationed there is Peter Osterhaus, who we can see over here on the right. And at first, Osterhaus doesn't believe that Buckner has the authority to surrender. And he has to show Osterhaus the orders from Smith saying, "You're in charge while I'm away." And so that then opens up negotiations. Osterhaus is reporting to Canby. So one thing folks don't realize, Canby is going to oversee the surrender of, more different groups of Confederates than anybody else. So that negotiation happens. In the meantime, John Magruder also realizes things down here in Galveston aren't going so well, and he's going to send a representative up here. And so Osterhaus is going to accept the surrender of all of these Confederates. That happens just as Kirby Smith gets to Galveston, only to discover that he's had his army surrendered out from underneath him. And he issues an order to his troops. "Soldiers, I'm left a commander without an army, a general without troops. You've made your choice. It was unwise and unpatriotic, but it is final. I pray you may not live to regret it. The enemy will now possess your country and dictate his own laws. You've voluntarily destroyed your organization and thrown away all means of resistance. Your present duties are plain. Return to your families. Resume the occupations of peace. Yield obedience to the laws. Labor to restore order. Strive both by counsel and example to give security to life and property. And may God in his mercy direct you aright and heal the wound of our distracted country." Um, so as much as he wanted to fight it out to the bitter end, he saw things were pretty hopeless. And again, he says, go back and resume the duties of peace. He'll sign the official surrender on a ship called the Fort Jackson in Galveston Harbor with Magruder there as well. Ironically, that same day, troops that are bringing the Texas Brigade back from Robert E. Lee's army arrive in Galveston with news about Lee's surrender. So this is all just kind of a nail in the coffin here for Kirby Smithdom. There's the Fort Jackson right there, by the way. So, but this takes place June 2nd, 1863. Word of the final surrender doesn't filter out through the whole community, and particularly the enslaved community, until the 19th of June, when Gordon Granger marches into Galveston with troops. You can see here a big mural that's in downtown Galveston that shows some of this story. It's got United States colored troops, and he's going to sign this proclamation that officially notifies people that slavery is over and that the enslaved population is free. And to me, it's remarkable. You think about the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect on January 1st, 1863, and here we are 2.5 years later before word is still filtering out. And it, sort of illustrates that idea that the Emancipation Proclamation doesn't free any slaves. If it's in areas of rebellion, how do you enforce that? Well, here we've had enslaved people in an area of rebellion who didn't even know the Emancipation Proclamation had existed. But Granger makes sure that word then gets out. And that's where the Juneteenth celebration comes from. I'll invite you to kind of think about this tomorrow, because I have heard people say, like, well, gosh, why don't we celebrate the ratification of the 13th Amendment? That's when slavery really ended, right? Which is true. But I think that for the same reason that we don't celebrate the, America's birthday on the day that the Constitution was ratified. It's a legal document. That's where the foundation of our laws comes from. But we celebrate America's birthday on the day that we finalize the Declaration of Independence because that's the spirit of the thing, isn't it? And I think Juneteenth really captures the spirit of the thing in a way that kind of that legal ratification process doesn't quite do. So just something for us to think about, and kind of the way that these surrenders have just really interesting ripples as they continue to stretch forward. Beyond this, also a surrender that takes place in the Trans-Mississippi. Here we have Meriwether Jefferson Thompson up in Jacksonport, Arkansas. And I got to read this to you. This dude is so angry and bitter. Many of the 8,000 men I now see around me, very many of you, have been skulking for the past 3 years in the swamps within a few miles of your own homes. Skulking duty. And during that time, have not seen your own children. I see many faces about me that have not been seen by any mortal man for the last 3 years. And what have you been doing all that time? Why, you've been laying in the swamps till the moss has grown 6 inches long on your back. And such men call themselves chivalrous soldiers. But you rally like brave and gallant men around Uncle Sam's commissary stores. And I now come to surrender you and hope you'll make better citizens than you have soldiers. He goes on and he says, go be good soldiers. And then those of you who've been good, honest, and brave soldiers have nothing to fear. But I warn those of you who've been nothing but sneaking, cowardly jayhawkers, cutthroats, and thieves that a just retribution awaits you. And I hope to God the federal authorities will hang you wherever and whenever they find you, and they'll do it for sure. I mean, he is angry about his men having decided to give up and surrender themselves. And so he goes and ends the war with a lot of venom on his tongue. The final Confederate surrender isn't a surrender by technical terms. It takes place in Dokesville, Oklahoma. If I back up to the map here, we can kind of see that right here near Fort Townsend. The Cherokees under Stan Waddy are going to come forward and basically renegotiate their treaty. Like, yeah, we've been allies with the Confederates. Now let's renegotiate the treaty and we'll become allies with the United States government again. So it's not necessarily a formal surrender. It takes place June 23rd because that's when Waddy finally is able to get into town to have these conversations. If you go there today, there's an archaeological site at Dokesville, a couple little monuments here. It's a neat site and there's a well as well, and sort of like the foundations of the original town are there. The town became a ghost town as the railroad came through a little to the south near Fort Townsend, and so this is sort of left behind and forgotten about. But it's if you ever find yourself out there, it's definitely a neat site and worth going to visit. Final last act of this whole drama, November 6th, 1865, when the CSS Shenandoah finally docks in England. The war's been over since April, so everything they've done from April to November officially is categorized as piracy. They didn't know the war was over. They had no way to know the war was over. And yet, because the war was over, they're really worried that they're going to get hung. So when they land in Liverpool, I don't know if they, I take that back. I'm not sure if they land in Liverpool. When they land in England, though, they're like, let's see if we can maybe kind of negotiate some way out of this. And they're finally able to do that. My friend, the late Dwight Hughes, has a wonderful book about the CSS Shenandoah called The Confederate Biography, if you want more details about that. So as I said, we'd crunch some numbers here at the end. You see Lee surrenders just under 30,000 at Appomattox. Johnston surrenders almost 90,000, 3 times as many. It's the largest surrender because he's in charge of everyone in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and most of Florida. And so all of those troops fall under his jurisdiction. Taylor is going to negotiate the surrender for 42,000. So again, we think about all those men spread across Alabama. He's got a significant number of troops that he would be able to keep in the field. Chalk Bluff, Arkansas, got about 7,800 guys there. And then Galveston, Texas, 58,000. So Kirby Smith, again, he's got a sizable number of men he'd be still able to put into the field out there. So there's some 22,000, we're talking about 250,000 Confederates still under arms as all of this begins. And because of logistical issues, because of communication issues, command issues, all those sorts of things, none of these armies are really able to kind of coalesce and become a going concern in order to keep this going. But I also want us to think about those two very important examples that Lee set. We're not going to go off and be guerrillas. And we see that time and time again through these other commanders, like go home and engage in the activities of peace. Go be good citizens, go be good neighbors. And we have that sense of magnanimity that Lincoln had said, let them up easy. That's not going to happen as Reconstruction sets in. We know that the radical Republicans in Congress are going to have a very vengeful mood, and Andrew Johnston's going to have a very vengeful mood, and then the two versions of vengefulness will compete against each other. So it really is going to become very tumultuous, and Lincoln's spirit of generosity is really not going to come through. But in the immediate short term, as Grant's able to oversee those things, it is able to settle each of these surrenders in ways that do make things easier to move forward. So I would like us to just kind of think about, some of those repercussions, some of those legacies, some of those ripples that I talked about. And we're going to see, Andrew Johnson and his presidency really kind of take what's happened and transform it in ways that I suspect Lincoln probably would never have recognized. Do we know that Reconstruction would have been easier under Lincoln? We don't. We know it'd be different, but Lincoln's going to then have to, if he survived, still have to contend with those same radical forces in Congress that Johnson did. Perhaps Lincoln would have been able to negotiate them a little smoother. He's been doing it for 4 years, but what that would still look like, we don't know. And so it's kind of hard to kind of game plan that out. So as we think about these surrenders, maybe it's no wonder that we go back to Appomattox time and time again, where soldiers were able to look each other in the eye, stack their arms, recognize the common valor that they shared on the battlefield. Their old foes now have to become their new countrymen again. And just that sense of reunion that comes forward. And what are the implications of that as well? It's a great, neat, and tidy ending to a story that is tumultuous and confusing. It's a place that we can come together and think about ourselves as those better angels of our nature that Lincoln had once upon encouraged us to think. So with that, I would like to just kind of leave you with one final thought, and that's this Unity Monument at Bennett Place. And again, that sense of coming together, that sense of reconciliation. After the war, the Bennett house will eventually burn down. The chimney that is in this reconstructed house is still original. There's a plaque in there that tells the story. But the property is eventually purchased so that it can become a park. And 1911, I think it is, this monument is put up. And, here this tablet's going to talk a little bit about the story. And there's a bas relief of the original building, which had not yet been reconstructed. And there's this idea of unity at the top. And certainly this was a place where North and South came back together, and that reconciliation that I mentioned. And I think it's a really powerful site for us to visit today, just as Appomattox is, because I think it still speaks to us. And if you take a look at that word unity and think about what does that mean and what does that mean to us, and North and South, black and white, today red and blue, that principle of unity, that we are stronger together, that we can move forward into the future together, and that sense of possibility that exists for us if we're able to do it together. And that to me is the most important legacy that these events have for us, because they still speak to us. They still serve as calls for us, as calls for actions for us today to think about moving forward together.
Hello, this is Trace Atkins. To stay up to date on all the latest and coolest videos, please subscribe to the Trust YouTube channel. Preserve, educate, inspire.